For many years, life seemed to flow in a predictable rhythm under the watchful eyes of the council. People went about their daily routines, believing that the authorities at the top were making decisions for the greater good. Every policy, every regulation, and every public announcement was accepted with a quiet obedience. From the very beginning, the council had presented themselves as wise and infallible, claiming they were there to protect humanity from dangers both seen and unseen. Schools taught children to respect the council, news outlets highlighted their achievements, and the general public followed instructions without questioning the motives behind them. This atmosphere of trust created a sense of stability that allowed people to focus on their personal lives, work, family, and daily responsibilities without feeling the need to challenge authority. People believed that the council's decisions were made with careful consideration, that they were transparent, and that everyone's well-being mattered. However, beneath this calm surface, subtle tensions were beginning to form. Not everyone shared the same faith in the council. Some individuals noticed inconsistencies in official statements or policies that seemed to favor certain groups while ignoring the struggles of ordinary citizens. Farmers, workers, teachers, and everyday families began to feel the weight of rising costs, shortages, and environmental problems that no one seemed to explain. Some wondered if the council truly had everyone's best interest in mind, or if there was another agenda hiding behind the facade of protection and guidance. These suspicions remained mostly private, shared quietly in hushed conversations at home, in small gatherings, or behind closed doors at work. At the same time, most people still clung to hope and belief in the council, thinking that perhaps these small problems were temporary or unavoidable, and that the leaders were doing their best under difficult circumstances. Whistleblowers, journalists, and activists were among the first to sense that something was seriously wrong. They started noticing patterns that did not match the council's public statements. Investigative reporters began piecing together evidence, quietly digging into records, policies, and decision-making processes. Whistleblowers from within the council or associated institutions began leaking small hints, emails, memos, and confidential documents that contradicted the official narrative. Yet for most citizens, these early warnings seemed distant, even abstract. People were accustomed to trusting the council, and the idea that the very institution meant to protect them could be hiding dangerous secrets was hard to accept. Skepticism was a natural reaction. After all, questioning the authority that had always been portrayed as wise and protective felt uncomfortable and even wrong. Meanwhile, life continued with its ordinary struggles. People went to work to earn a living, paid bills, raised children, and tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. Some communities faced environmental issues, like water shortages, polluted air, or unusual climate changes, which affected their daily lives. Hospitals reported resource shortages, schools faced overcrowding, and public services struggled to keep up with demand. These challenges weighed heavily on ordinary people, even if they could not directly trace them back to the council's decisions. Families noticed that things were not as fair or as just as they had been led to believe. There was a growing sense of unease, a feeling that life was becoming harder, that opportunities were disappearing, and that promises of security were not being kept. But still, the council's reputation remained strong in the eyes of the majority. The public wanted to believe that their leaders had everything under control, that they were working tirelessly behind the scenes to manage crises, and that any difficulties were temporary setbacks. In addition to daily struggles, the influence of media and communication played a significant role in shaping public perception. News outlets, social media, and entertainment often echoed the official narrative, presenting the council in a positive light. Reports highlighted successes, progress, and achievements, creating an illusion that all was well. Critical voices were often dismissed, ignored, or labeled as conspiracy theorists. This selective information flow created a sense of security in the general public. People felt reassured that things were under control, even when their personal experiences suggested otherwise. They were trapped in a carefully constructed bubble where only certain information reached them, and skepticism was discouraged. Yet some individuals, particularly those who were curious, analytical, or personally affected by hardships, could not ignore the growing discrepancies between reality and what they were told. Amid all this, small groups of concerned citizens began sharing their doubts and observations quietly. They discussed unusual patterns in government spending, unexplained policy changes, and environmental issues that were conveniently overlooked. Some of them were ordinary workers who noticed waste or corruption in local offices. Others were professionals, engineers, teachers, doctors, who had direct insight into areas the council was supposed to manage. These discussions were private at first, whispered over cups of tea or in online forums because people feared being ostracized or punished. Nevertheless, the seeds of awareness were being planted. Gradually, these small ripples of suspicion began to form a larger undercurrent of concern. While most of humanity went about its daily life trusting the council, a growing minority began to question, investigate, and prepare for the possibility that the truth might be very different from what they had been told. At the same time, everyday citizens continued to experience the subtle but accumulating pressures of a system that seemed increasingly unresponsive. Families struggled to make ends meet as costs rose faster than wages. Young people worried about limited opportunities, while older generations faced healthcare and social support challenges. Environmental changes caused unexpected hardships like poor crop yields or natural disasters that seemed to occur more frequently. Communities noticed that emergency responses were often delayed or mismanaged. While these issues were tangible and immediate, the connection to the council's decisions remained unclear for many. People blamed circumstance, luck, or other uncontrollable factors, not realizing that hidden decisions at the highest level were creating many of the problems they faced. Despite these challenges, a sense of routine and obedience remained deeply ingrained. People went to work, followed rules, paid taxes, and trusted that the system, as flawed as it might seem, was ultimately meant to help them. Children grew up learning about the council as a guiding authority. Teachers reinforced respect for leadership, and public campaigns emphasized loyalty, patience, and faith in the system. Even as cracks began to show, these habits and social norms were hard to break. The average person was torn between personal experience, growing doubts, and years of conditioning to trust the system. It created an inner tension, the desire to believe versus the small nagging evidence that not everything was as it seemed. By the end of this period, the stage was set for a major shift. People were still largely unaware of the full extent of the council's deception, but the combination of everyday struggles, whispered doubts, and isolated warnings had begun to weaken the unquestioning trust that once prevailed. Humanity was living in a fragile equilibrium, outwardly calm but with undercurrents of concern, suspicion, and curiosity. This was a world on the edge, where the first signs of rebellion were not yet visible, but the foundations of outrage were quietly forming. What seemed like ordinary life, the daily work, school, family duties, and social routines, was hiding a simmering potential for awakening, a readiness to confront truth, and a growing desire to demand accountability. The calm before the storm was both deceptive and dangerous. People felt it in small ways, but they had not yet seen the full picture. Only time would reveal how quickly trust could turn to anger, and how the exposure of lies could ignite a movement that would challenge everything they had believed for generations. The cracks that had quietly begun to form in people's trust slowly widened as small pieces of information started to surface. At first, they were subtle hints, almost like whispers carried on the wind. A leaked document here, a suspicious email there. Nothing overtly dramatic, but enough to make a few careful observers raise their eyebrows. These small leaks came from people who had worked for the council, or were connected to those in power. They had seen things that disturbed them, decisions that made no sense, or actions that seemed deliberately misleading. Many of these whistleblowers were ordinary employees who had never intended to make headlines. They simply wanted the truth to be known, to protect others, or to clear their conscience. Initially, their information was limited, fragmentary, and sometimes confusing. Yet over time, patterns began to emerge, revealing something far more serious than anyone had suspected. At first, many citizens dismissed these leaks as rumors or exaggerated claims. They wanted to believe that the council was still acting in the public interest, that any mistakes were minor or accidental, and that those in power could be trusted. Skepticism was natural. After all, the council had been seen as wise and protective for decades, and the thought that they could deliberately mislead people felt impossible. However, as independent researchers, journalists, and activists began verifying the leaked information, the reality could no longer be ignored. They discovered documents showing deliberate manipulation of data, plans that favored the wealthy and powerful, and decisions that knowingly harmed vulnerable communities. It became increasingly clear that the problems ordinary people had been feeling for years were not accidental. They were often the result of intentional choices made by those at the top. This growing awareness created a wave of conflicting emotions among citizens. Shock, disbelief, and anger mixed with a sense of betrayal so deep that it was hard for many to process. For decades, they had been taught to trust the council completely. The betrayal cut to the core of their understanding of society. People began to realize that the struggles they and their families faced, the rising costs, lack of resources, environmental dangers, and limited opportunities, were not just unfortunate circumstances. They were symptoms of systemic mismanagement and corruption. Ordinary citizens began to connect their personal experiences to the decisions of the council, seeing the hidden threads that linked their hardships to actions taken in secret. This connection between cause and effect was terrifying and infuriating at the same time. Once the first cracks of awareness appeared, it spread rapidly. Conversations at workplaces, in homes, and online forums shifted in tone. People who had quietly questioned the council began speaking openly, sharing what they had discovered. Stories of lost jobs, failed projects, or mismanaged crises now had a name and a face behind them: the council. The disbelief and denial that had held people back slowly gave way to outrage. Ordinary citizens who had once felt powerless and small started to see that their experiences were part of a larger, coordinated pattern. The more they learned, the clearer it became that the issues they had tolerated for years were not random. They were the outcome of deliberate planning and deceit. At the same time, the media began reporting on these revelations, often cautiously at first. Some outlets were sympathetic to the council and tried to frame the leaks as minor mistakes, but independent and investigative journalists published detailed analyses and reports that could not be ignored. Video evidence, audio recordings, and official memos were examined and verified. People began watching live streams, reading documents, and sharing information among themselves. Social media became a critical platform for spreading verified evidence and raising awareness. The council's attempts to suppress these stories only fueled public curiosity and anger. The more they tried to silence journalists or whistleblowers, the more citizens became determined to uncover the full truth. As evidence mounted, the scale of the deception became apparent. Citizens discovered that major policies had been implemented not for the public good, but for profit, power, and control. Environmental crises had been downplayed to protect corporate interests. Economic disparities were widened intentionally, with resources directed toward elites rather than those in need. Public health issues were neglected, sometimes catastrophically, because acknowledging them openly would have been politically inconvenient. People realized that the council had not merely failed in their duties, they had actively worked against the interests of the majority. The level of betrayal felt overwhelming. Families who had struggled for decades now saw that their suffering was preventable, that someone had chosen to ignore or worsen their hardships for selfish gain. The more ordinary citizens understood the depth of the deception, the stronger their emotions became. Anger was the most obvious reaction. It was not the calm, quiet frustration of minor inconveniences, but a boiling, intense rage. People felt cheated, lied to, and manipulated. They had followed the rules, obeyed the laws, and trusted their leaders, only to discover that trust had been misplaced. Communities discussed these revelations endlessly, debating how to respond. Families questioned whether it was safe to continue living as they had, while workers wondered whether the jobs they held were sustainable under a system built on deception. Students and young adults felt a sense of loss, realizing that their future had been shaped by lies and hidden agendas. As this wave of awareness spread, groups began organizing themselves. Online communities, discussion groups, and local forums became hubs for sharing information, strategies, and plans. Citizens who had previously felt powerless now felt emboldened by collective knowledge and action. They began analyzing policies, exposing more lies, and demanding accountability. The movement was not yet violent or chaotic, but it had a clear energy, a determined, restless desire for truth and justice. People were no longer willing to passively accept what the council dictated. Ordinary individuals working together were beginning to challenge the established order. The council at first underestimated the situation. They assumed that most people would continue trusting them, or that confusion and fear would prevent meaningful collective action. They attempted minor adjustments and public relations efforts to calm suspicions, releasing statements claiming transparency and promising investigations. But these measures backfired. People had already seen evidence of deceit, and they recognized the statements as attempts to manipulate perception rather than admit wrongdoing. This only increased public anger. Ordinary citizens realized that if the council could lie about small matters, they could also lie about significant decisions. Trust evaporated, replaced by a collective skepticism that grew stronger every day. Another factor that amplified public outrage was the human tendency to empathize with others who had been harmed. Stories began circulating about families ruined by mismanaged policies, communities left vulnerable to environmental disasters, and workers denied justice. People connected emotionally to these narratives because they saw themselves reflected in them. The sense of injustice was no longer abstract. It was deeply personal. Ordinary citizens began seeing their own struggles as part of a broader, intentional system of exploitation and concealment. Empathy fueled their outrage, making it not just about self-interest, but about the desire to protect others and demand fairness. With mounting anger and clarity, a sense of unity began to emerge among ordinary citizens. People from different walks of life, workers, students, parents, and even former council employees, started recognizing shared experiences of betrayal. Differences of background, status, or location faded in the face of a common understanding. The council had deceived them all. Conversations once private became public discussions, and small communities of knowledge and resistance began forming across cities, countries, and continents. People realized that individually they were limited in power, but collectively they could hold the council accountable. This sense of unity and shared purpose strengthened their resolve, preparing humanity for the significant actions and confrontations that were soon to come. By the end of this period, what began as scattered leaks and rumors had grown into a recognizable, undeniable reality. The evidence was solid, the outrage widespread, and the collective understanding of deception undeniable. Humanity had moved from quiet suspicion to informed awareness, and the emotional shift was profound. Shock and disbelief had evolved into anger, outrage, and a powerful sense of betrayal. The stage was now set for open confrontation, collective action, and demands for truth. Ordinary people, once passive and trusting, were awakening to the realization that they could no longer rely on the council to act in their best interests. The simmering frustration of decades had found a concrete target, and the next steps would determine whether humanity could finally reclaim control over its destiny. The events of this period proved that truth, once discovered, has a momentum of its own. Even the most controlled systems cannot contain the ripple effects of exposure. Whistleblowers, journalists, and ordinary citizens had acted as catalysts, and now the wave of awareness and outrage was growing unstoppable. Communities were organizing, sharing information, and preparing to confront the deception head-on. Humanity was on the brink of a major turning point, and the calm obedience of the past was rapidly dissolving into a powerful, collective desire for justice, accountability, and transparency. The moment of quiet suspicion had now fully transformed into visible, undeniable outrage. The leaks, the revelations, and the mounting evidence had moved from whispered discussions into the public eye, and humanity could no longer ignore the betrayal of the council. Ordinary citizens who had spent years feeling powerless now found themselves driven by anger, determination, and a shared sense of injustice. The simmering frustrations of daily struggles, the rising costs of living, environmental crises, neglected communities, and social inequality were no longer abstract problems. People understood clearly that these hardships were not random or inevitable. They were the deliberate result of decisions made by those at the top, and with this understanding, humanity's patience finally reached its limit. Protests began in small waves, often in local communities where the sense of betrayal was strongest. At first, these demonstrations were modest, gatherings of concerned citizens holding signs, chanting slogans, and demanding accountability. Local authorities often dismissed these early protests, believing them to be minor and manageable. But the gatherings grew steadily, fueled by a combination of social media sharing, word-of-mouth communication, and a collective determination that could no longer be contained. Ordinary people who had previously remained silent or indifferent began to join these movements, bringing with them stories, evidence, and personal experiences that added weight and credibility to the growing public anger. These protests were not just about dissatisfaction. They were about a demand for truth and justice, a refusal to allow deception and corruption to continue unchecked. The anger that humanity felt was profound, intense, and highly personal. Families, workers, students, and retirees all felt the impact of the council's deceit in different ways, yet their outrage united them. People had lost faith in leaders who had promised protection and fairness, only to find themselves manipulated and betrayed. This anger did not remain passive. It inspired action. Citizens began to organize in ways that were unprecedented, creating networks, forming committees, and coordinating events to make their voices heard. Activists shared verified information, documented council misconduct, and held public discussions to educate others. The movement grew not just in numbers, but in clarity and focus. People were no longer reacting to individual grievances. They were confronting a system of lies that had affected everyone in one way or another. As the protests spread, the council struggled to respond. Initial attempts to downplay the leaks or dismiss the public outrage were met with skepticism and further anger. Statements claiming transparency, promises of internal investigations, and reassurances of future reforms were widely recognized as empty words. Ordinary citizens had seen enough evidence to know that the council's assurances could not be trusted. This recognition further intensified public rage, turning what might have been simple demonstrations into powerful, organized movements that demanded real change. The more the council tried to maintain its authority through rhetoric or intimidation, the more determined people became. Humanity was no longer waiting quietly for answers. It was demanding them openly, collectively, and forcefully. The movement was diverse. Students, teachers, office workers, laborers, healthcare professionals, and even some former council employees joined in solidarity. People shared experiences, documents, and stories that exposed how the council's actions had affected their lives. This diversity of participants strengthened the movement, showing that corruption and deceit were not just abstract issues. They had real consequences for everyone, regardless of age, profession, or social status. Communities that had once been disconnected now found themselves united by a common cause. The shared sense of betrayal and the determination to seek justice created a bond that was stronger than fear or intimidation. Humanity was discovering the power of collective action, realizing that ordinary people, when united, could confront even the most entrenched authority. Public demonstrations became more strategic as organizers learned from each protest. They coordinated locations, times, and messages, ensuring that their presence could not be ignored. They used technology to spread verified information, live stream events, and document every interaction with authorities. Media coverage increased, first hesitantly and later with full attention, as journalists recognized the historical significance of the events unfolding. Footage of peaceful protests, heated discussions, and confrontations with officials began circulating widely, inspiring more people to join the movement. Each protest was not just a display of anger. It was a signal to the council that humanity was awake, aware, and unwilling to accept lies any longer. As protests intensified, the council attempted to maintain control through threats, intimidation, and misinformation. They warned of legal consequences, attempted to censor online platforms, and tried to divide the movement by spreading rumors and creating confusion. But these efforts only had the opposite effect. Ordinary citizens, having already experienced deception for years, were no longer willing to be manipulated. Attempts to intimidate activists were met with resilience, and misinformation was quickly countered by citizen journalists and independent investigators. The movement had grown beyond simple protest. It had become a carefully coordinated, informed, and highly motivated force, demanding accountability. Humanity had transformed from passive obedience into active resistance. The scale of the outrage was unprecedented. Streets were filled with demonstrators chanting, waving signs, and demanding answers. Public squares, government offices, and even major corporations associated with the council saw crowds gathering. People were not just angry. They were informed, organized, and strategic. They carried evidence, read statements aloud, and confronted officials directly. The energy was electric, fueled by years of frustration, deception, and betrayal. This was no longer a momentary eruption of anger. It was a sustained, powerful movement that showed the world that ordinary people could challenge even the most powerful institutions when they acted together. As the protests continued, more whistleblowers came forward. Emboldened by the growing visibility of the movement, they revealed further documents, recordings, and first-hand accounts of the council's deceit. Each revelation added credibility to the anger of the masses and made it increasingly impossible for the council to deny wrongdoing. Citizens studied, verified, and shared these revelations widely, creating a feedback loop of knowledge and empowerment. People realized that they were no longer powerless. Information and collective action were powerful tools in holding the council accountable. This realization strengthened their resolve and intensified the pace and scale of public demonstrations. The anger of humanity was not mindless or chaotic. It was purposeful and focused. Citizens demanded resignations, investigations, and immediate transparency. They called for accountability for those responsible for years of deception and harm. Communities developed strategies to document corruption, gather evidence, and present their findings to legal authorities, the media, and international organizations. People were learning quickly that organized action could achieve results where isolated complaints had failed. The intensity of public outrage was matched by its intelligence, creating a movement that was both passionate and strategic. Families, communities, and even workplaces became centers of organization. Ordinary citizens shared strategies for peaceful protest, documented injustices, and planned ways to amplify their message. Social media became a vital platform for information sharing, live updates, and coordination. People realized that unity, clarity, and persistence were essential to confronting an authority that had lied for decades. The council, once confident in its control, now faced a challenge it could not easily dismiss or manipulate. Humanity had found its collective voice, and it was loud, persistent, and impossible to ignore. By this stage, public outrage had become an unstoppable force. People were no longer asking for small reforms. They were demanding a complete reckoning. Ordinary citizens understood that the issues were systemic, that the council's actions had affected generations, and that accountability required more than mere apologies. Communities called for investigations, reforms, and the removal of those responsible for corruption and deceit. Citizens were willing to risk personal comfort, safety, and social standing to stand for truth and justice. The movement had grown beyond protests. It had become a defining moment in human history, a mass awakening that could not be suppressed. Even in the face of threats, misinformation, or attempts to divide them, people remained committed. Each demonstration, each act of documentation, and each shared revelation reinforced the collective belief that the council could no longer dictate terms or hide the truth. Ordinary citizens had become the arbiters of accountability, wielding evidence, unity, and persistent action as tools to demand justice. Humanity had reached a tipping point where obedience had been replaced by awareness. Skepticism had evolved into organized action, and passive frustration had turned into active resistance. By the end of this period, humanity's anger had fully matured into a powerful collective movement. Ordinary people had shifted from suspicion to understanding, from disbelief to outrage, and from passive frustration to determined action. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would challenge the council's authority directly. Humanity had discovered its power when united, and the momentum of the movement could not be stopped. Protests, documentation, and collective action had become more than reactions. They were the driving forces of change. Citizens were no longer waiting quietly. They were demanding accountability, transparency, and justice with unwavering resolve. This period marked the true awakening of humanity. The council, which had once ruled with near total control over information and perception, now faced a population that was informed, organized, and determined. Ordinary citizens had learned that knowledge was power, unity was strength, and persistence could challenge even the most entrenched authority. The movement was no longer just a response to deceit. It had become a symbol of the potential of humanity to demand truth and to confront injustice, no matter how powerful the deceivers might be. In this stage, anger had transformed into action, and action had become the foundation of a movement that would change the course of history. The momentum of the protests and public outrage had grown beyond anything the Council could have predicted. Humanity's voice had become a force loud, persistent, and impossible to ignore. People were no longer satisfied with half measures or empty promises. They wanted truth, accountability, and tangible change. What had started as anger had evolved into a coordinated effort to expose the Council's deceit fully, to demand justice for decades of manipulation, and to reclaim control over the systems that affected their lives. This was no longer a movement of scattered protests. It was a united front, a collective struggle for transparency and fairness, fueled by determination, evidence, and courage. Whistleblowers, emboldened by the growing visibility of the movement, began coming forward in greater numbers. They provided more concrete evidence, revealing the inner workings of the Council, secret agendas, and previously hidden documents that detailed mismanagement and corruption. Some of these insiders had spent decades within the Council, witnessing decisions being made in secret, policies being manipulated for profit, and vulnerable communities being ignored or actively harmed. They had remained silent for fear of retaliation, but the strength of the public movement gave them courage. Each new revelation added weight to the protests, validated citizen outrage, and made it increasingly impossible for the Council to deny its wrongdoing. Ordinary people realized that the battle was no longer abstract. It was backed by verifiable proof that could not be ignored. Citizen, collectives, and investigative journalists played a crucial role in amplifying these revelations. People were no longer passively consuming information. They were actively verifying, documenting, and distributing it. They shared evidence across social media, independent news platforms, and community forums. Videos, audio recordings, official memos, and eyewitness testimonies were all compiled, analyzed, and presented in ways that were easy for the public to understand. Ordinary citizens became investigators themselves, piecing together a complex puzzle of lies, corruption, and neglect. The Council, which had relied on secrecy and information control, found that its power was rapidly eroding. Humanity had discovered the truth, and once the truth was known, it could not be hidden again. As the movement grew, ordinary people began to organize more strategically. Local communities formed committees to coordinate protests, share verified information, and educate the public about the Council's actions. They developed strategies to document misconduct, ensuring that every encounter with officials, every statement, and every piece of evidence was recorded and preserved. People realized that disorganization could weaken their cause, so they worked to create networks that connected cities, regions, and even countries. This coordination allowed the movement to maintain pressure on the Council continuously, preventing officials from downplaying the crisis or manipulating public perception. Humanity was discovering its collective power, learning that unity, organization, and persistence were the keys to holding those in power accountable. The Council, now aware of the scale and seriousness of the movement, tried to respond. They released public statements promising investigations, reforms, and accountability. They attempted to intimidate activists with threats of legal action, to censor online discussions, and to discredit whistleblowers. However, these efforts failed. Ordinary citizens had already seen through decades of deception, and they recognized the Council's statements as manipulative tactics rather than genuine attempts at change. Attempts at intimidation only strengthened public resolve. People understood that the Council's power relied heavily on fear and secrecy, and the movement's transparency and unity had effectively neutralized those tools. Ordinary citizens were now confident, empowered, and unafraid to demand justice. At the same time, international organizations, legal bodies, and even some sympathetic members of the Council began to take notice. Reports, evidence, and documentation collected by ordinary citizens reached legal authorities, human rights groups, and media organizations worldwide. These external entities validated the findings of the public movement, adding legitimacy to the claims of corruption and deceit. Some members within the Council who had previously remained silent began to voice support for reform and transparency, recognizing that the tide of public opinion could no longer be ignored. Humanity was no longer fighting alone. The movement had gained allies both inside and outside the system, strengthening its capacity to demand accountability. Communities also began to focus on practical actions, to ensure that change would be sustainable. People realized that exposing lies and demanding resignations was only part of the solution. They needed systemic reforms to prevent future deception. Citizen committees drafted proposals for transparent decision-making, public oversight, and policies designed to protect vulnerable communities. Ordinary people contributed ideas based on their experiences, knowledge, and expertise, ensuring that the proposed reforms were grounded in reality. The movement had evolved from a reactive expression of anger into a proactive effort to reshape governance, create fairness, and build a system that could withstand corruption. Throughout this period, the intensity of public engagement was extraordinary. Citizens attended demonstrations, meetings, and online discussions, often dedicating long hours to the cause. Families, workers, and students all participated, understanding that the movement was not just about current grievances, but about shaping a better future for generations to come. The energy of humanity was relentless. People were willing to sacrifice personal comfort, safety, and convenience to ensure that truth prevailed. This collective commitment was unlike anything the council had encountered before. It was no longer possible to dismiss citizens as passive or obedient. They were active participants in shaping their own destiny. The movement also fostered a sense of moral responsibility. People recognized that silence in the face of injustice could allow corruption to continue unchecked. Ordinary citizens felt compelled to speak, document, and act because they understood that change required participation. This moral awakening added strength to the movement, as individuals were motivated not only by personal grievances, but by a genuine desire to protect their communities and future generations. Empathy and shared responsibility became guiding principles, making the struggle for truth and accountability deeply human and profoundly personal. The council, facing mounting pressure, began to crumble under the weight of public scrutiny. Leaders who had once relied on authority, secrecy, and manipulation now found themselves cornered. Attempts to delay investigations, dismiss protests, or manipulate perception were met with increasing resistance. Every lie exposed, every document revealed, and every testimony verified chipped away at their power. Ordinary citizens had become the architects of accountability, demonstrating that persistent, informed, and organized action could confront even the most entrenched authority. Humanity had transformed from a passive population into an active force capable of challenging deception and demanding justice. As more evidence surfaced, humanity's confidence grew. Citizens realized that their collective efforts were making a real difference. Council members who had participated in corruption or deception could no longer hide, and public pressure forced investigations, resignations, and legal action. The movement was not simply symbolic. It produced tangible results. Ordinary people had discovered that their voices, when united and informed, could shape the course of history. The feeling of empowerment spread widely, inspiring more participation and reinforcing the idea that justice could be achieved through persistence and collective action. By the end of this period, humanity had reached a critical turning point. The Council's authority had been challenged decisively, and ordinary citizens had proven their capacity to hold powerful institutions accountable. The movement had shifted from anger and protest to concrete action, reform proposals, and sustained engagement. Humanity had learned that deception could be confronted, corruption exposed, and justice pursued through organization, evidence, and unity. The struggle was not yet complete, but the foundations for systemic change had been firmly established. The energy, courage, and persistence of ordinary people had created a force that could no longer be ignored. This period marked the transformation of anger into strategy, frustration into action, and outrage into systemic reform. Humanity had discovered its collective power, learned the importance of documentation, verification, and organization, and realized that accountability was possible when citizens were informed, united, and persistent. The movement had grown beyond protests. It had become a powerful force for structural change, a symbol of the potential of ordinary people to challenge deception, and a beacon of hope for transparency and justice. The fight for truth was no longer a distant ideal. It was a practical, achievable goal, pursued by millions who refused to remain passive in the face of corruption. The events of this stage demonstrated that humanity's strength lay in its ability to unite, act strategically, and demand accountability. Ordinary citizens, once passive, had become the driving force of justice. Whistleblowers, journalists, legal authorities, and ordinary people worked together, creating a movement that could challenge even the most powerful institutions. Every act of documentation, every protest, and every shared piece of evidence contributed to the erosion of deception and the establishment of truth. Humanity had entered a new era of awareness, empowerment, and responsibility, proving that when people act together, corruption and deceit cannot endure. The relentless pressure, the unyielding protests, and the unstoppable flow of evidence finally reached their peak. Humanity's determination to confront deception had created a situation that the Council could no longer control. The accumulated outrage, organization, and insistence on accountability had dismantled the carefully constructed facade of authority. Ordinary citizens, empowered by knowledge, evidence, and unity, had transformed into a force that demanded real change. The lies, cover-ups, and manipulations that had once seemed untouchable were now exposed for the world to see. The people had moved from suspicion to awareness, from anger to action, and now stood on the brink of triumph. As the public movement reached its climax, the Council began to crumble. Leaders who had once commanded unquestioned respect were now facing widespread condemnation. Resignations started to take place, not as voluntary acts of conscience, but because the weight of accountability had become impossible to ignore. Citizens had meticulously documented every misstep, every deception, and every hidden agenda. The evidence was undeniable, and the Council had no room to maneuver. Former allies within the Council who had initially hesitated to speak out now stepped forward to support reform, unwilling to be associated with the collapse of credibility. Humanity's unified voice had exposed the truth, leaving no choice but to act. The process of accountability began with public investigations. Legal authorities, supported by the evidence collected by ordinary citizens, launched inquiries into the actions of Council members. Public hearings were held, allowing whistleblowers, experts, and affected citizens to testify openly. These hearings were not just symbolic. They were rigorous, detailed, and structured to uncover the full extent of corruption and deception. Families, communities, and individuals shared their stories, highlighting how the Council's lies had directly affected their lives. From mismanaged resources to ignored environmental disasters, the scope of wrongdoing became painfully clear. Ordinary citizens watched, participated, and contributed, ensuring that the process was transparent, fair, and inclusive. The trials and inquiries were dramatic, revealing layers of deception that had persisted for decades. Documents, recordings, and first-hand testimonies were presented in meticulous detail, exposing patterns of neglect, manipulation, and exploitation. The public watched closely, often with a mix of anger, disbelief, and relief. Seeing the truth laid bare in such a comprehensive manner validated the struggles, frustrations, and anger that had fueled the movement from the beginning. Citizens felt a sense of justice being served, not because revenge was taken, but because truth was acknowledged and accountability enforced. The sense of collective achievement was immense, showing that ordinary people, when united, could challenge even the most powerful institutions. Reforms were introduced to ensure that such deception could never happen again. Transparency became a central principle of governance, with mechanisms designed to hold leaders accountable to the public at all times. Citizen oversight committees were established to monitor policy decisions and resource allocations. Environmental policies, economic regulations, and social programs were revised to prioritize fairness, justice, and sustainability. Ordinary citizens played an active role in shaping these reforms, contributing their experiences, knowledge, and ideas to create systems that were practical and effective. The movement had shifted from protest to constructive action, demonstrating that accountability was not just about punishment, but about creating a better, fairer society for everyone. As the reforms took shape, humanity experienced a renewed sense of empowerment. People who had once felt powerless now understood the magnitude of what could be achieved when citizens acted collectively. The realization that ordinary individuals could challenge entrenched authority and demand transparency inspired a new culture of vigilance, participation, and engagement. Communities became more resilient, organizations more accountable, and citizens more aware of their rights and responsibilities. The lessons learned from the struggle against the council were applied to daily life, governance, and social interaction, creating a society that valued truth, fairness, and collaboration. This period also brought a profound emotional closure for many. The anger that had fueled protests gradually transformed into a sense of relief, achievement, and cautious optimism. Families who had endured hardship as a result of the council's deception finally saw acknowledgement of their struggles. Communities that had felt abandoned now felt heard, validated, and empowered. Ordinary citizens experienced a deep sense of satisfaction in knowing that their efforts had tangible results. The movement was not just a historical moment. It was a personal victory for countless individuals who had invested time, energy, and courage to demand justice. Education and awareness campaigns became central to this new era. Citizens emphasized the importance of critical thinking, transparency, and civic engagement. Schools, universities, and community programs incorporated lessons learned from the struggle, teaching future generations about the value of questioning authority, verifying information, and holding leaders accountable. Ordinary people who had participated in the movement became mentors, educators, and advocates for civic responsibility. The movement's legacy was not just political, it was cultural, instilling values that would shape society for generations. The impact of these changes was felt across every aspect of life. Economic systems became more equitable, environmental policies more sustainable, and social programs more responsive to actual needs. Ordinary citizens, once marginalized in decision-making processes, now had channels through which their voices could be heard. Community engagement flourished, and the relationship between government and the public became more transparent and collaborative. Humanity had transformed its anger and outrage into a constructive force that reshaped society, creating systems that were fair, accountable, and sustainable. Trust, though shaken, slowly began to rebuild. People had learned the hard way that authority must be constantly monitored, that deception could have devastating consequences, and that active participation was essential to maintaining fairness. The rebuilding of trust was gradual, based on transparency, consistent accountability, and a shared commitment to preventing the mistakes of the past. Citizens were now more vigilant, aware that their engagement and oversight were vital to maintaining a just society. The lessons of betrayal and deception had left a mark, but they had also created a foundation for stronger, more resilient communities. Humanity's victory was not only political or legal, it was deeply personal. Individuals who had once felt powerless now understood that their voices, actions, and persistence mattered. Ordinary citizens had learned that change was possible when people acted collectively, informed themselves thoroughly, and maintained a relentless focus on truth. The success of the movement demonstrated that democracy, accountability, and justice were not abstract ideals. They were practical outcomes that could be achieved through courage, organization, and unity. As the dust settled, humanity entered a period of reflection. People looked back on the years of deception, manipulation, and hardship, and recognized how close they had come to being silenced. This reflection was not merely sorrowful, it was instructive. Lessons were drawn about the importance of transparency, vigilance, and collective responsibility. Citizens recognized that they must remain engaged, informed, and proactive to prevent any future abuses of power. The experience strengthened social bonds, creating a sense of shared purpose and responsibility that transcended individual differences. The success of the movement also inspired hope for the future. Ordinary citizens understood that they had the ability to shape society, influence policies, and ensure justice. Communities were more cohesive, social programs more effective, and governance more transparent. The experience had revealed the true power of collective action, showing that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary results when they united for a common purpose. Humanity had not only confronted the council, it had redefined what it meant to be an active, responsible, and empowered society. In the end, humanity emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined to protect the truth. The council's lies had been exposed, accountability enforced, and reforms implemented. Ordinary citizens had proven that persistence, unity, and courage could challenge even the most entrenched power structures. The movement became a symbol of hope, resilience, and the enduring potential of humanity to demand justice and fairness. While scars remained from years of deception, The victory had created a society better equipped to face future challenges, more aware of the importance of vigilance, and committed to the principles of transparency, accountability, and collective action. In the final analysis, humanity's rage, once a dangerous and uncontained force, had been transformed into constructive, meaningful change. The Council's lies had been exposed, justice had been pursued, and society had been reshaped in ways that prioritized fairness, transparency, and collective empowerment. The ordinary people who had initiated, fueled, and sustained this movement emerged as the true heroes of this story. They proved that no matter how powerful a system of deception may seem, the collective will of an informed, organized, and determined population could achieve accountability, reform, and hope for the future. Humanity had reclaimed its voice, its power, and its destiny, creating a society stronger, wiser, and more just than ever before.